What is up, guys? This is All the Smoke on Strength and Physique with your hosts, Adam and Chris, where we provide you with evidence-based information, community support, and recognition to all who are betting themselves with fitness.
All right, guys, welcome back to another episode on All the Smoke on Strength and Physique. Man, we got a special guest, and I would say, as before we kind of started this conversation, this man has got the experience, he's got the knowledge, and more important, he's got it. We're way ahead. Like, he's way ahead. The whole educated dieter, I would say, company is way ahead of what we are currently doing. And just kind of, obviously, this is going to come out way before we release it. But the conversation I just had just kind of opens my eyes of how far or how messed up the fitness industry can it be. And I'm excited to kind of hopefully, educate you on this aspect that, again, is sustainable, maintainable, and more importantly, with how William said it, right? What's going on internally is a direct correlation to what's going on externally, how you present yourself externally. So, Gillis, I'll shut up now. If you could, tell our 8 listeners who you are. If you could, please let them know what you're about, please.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me on. I'm super excited, as you've mentioned. One of the assistant coaches of the Educated Dieter, that's also one of the co-owners of Advanced Coaching Systems. But essentially, you're exactly right. I think we're on the forefront of seeing just how much our industry essentially is changing from where it first began like 10, 15 years ago, right? This is a relatively new industry. So it was built, its foundation was built on kind of extremes, if you will, right? So, and that still lingers around, but I think over the evolution of our actual industry, we're starting to see that change. We're starting to see that turn. So I think a lot of what we do within the Educated Dieter is we're actually trying to just make that positive impact to take away more of the extremism that's really in our industry by just more broadening and having more open-minded coaches in the space that can essentially make more of a positive impact on the people that are seeking our help.
Yeah, I totally agree. And if you don't mind, could you kind of explain your guys' approach at the Educated Dieter that you would differentiate from, the current industry's approach? As you said, it's so extreme.
Yeah, so I think for us, we deal with quite of, various different types of people that are gen pop all the way to physique athletes. I know with William, he's come from a physique background and specifically in the growth of his coaching career. And so essentially what we do, is we do a pretty thorough screening of our clients. We actually make sure that we're actually getting on calls with them at least once a monthly. But even before we actually decide to take on that person, we get on a live Zoom call. We kind of lay out what we're making sure that they're a good fit for us and we're a good fit for them. Just to make sure that they understand what the vision is that we have for our clients and that they're on the same page with us.
And I think the really cool approach that we'll talk about a ton is the hormones side of things. And that's something that is not really taught for exercise science individuals. Adam, you might be able to attest to this, but I don't even know if it's taught at a PhD level as much as what it possibly should be. Is it, Adam?
I can't really vouch for that. I haven't started it yet.
Okay.
But I would say, no. So kind of beating that, from just being in that course the last 2 weeks, I was like, especially the bioenergetics course, like no harm on, all the classes that I take. I was like, that was way more in depth from my, now 6 years in academia, which says a lot. And the problem, what I would say, even with physical therapy and chiro and some of the trends that we've had on our podcast is, academia is so behind. Like, a lot of those individuals don't even have experience in the trenches, like Gillis, as William, sure. And a lot of us, like those people that we're having on, they are in the trenches. They're seeing it beforehand, and that, again, that's the problem with some of the research. But I haven't had any experience, and that was one of the reasons why I joined ACS.
Yeah, and I think that's extremely important topic, and I'm sure you can agree with it, Gillis, is that academia, oh my Lord, I don't understand why we are not coaching coaches to be coaches, or not coaching coaches, but teaching coaches to be coaches. Because once you become a coach, then you need coaching to become a coach.
Sure.
It's just not there in academia. And cool, I get that we will learn about the different chambers of the heart, the physiological aspects. That's all very important. But like, we're not also talking about all of the psychological side of things. The main thing we're going to be talking about is the hormonal side of things in this podcast. And there's just so many different aspects of coaching that we just don't touch on.
Yeah, I think what's important, man, is that none of these things are independent of each other. So I think it's super, I think it's the evolution of how coaching is going to end up being is that all of these things are going to be kind of intertwined together and connecting the dots. And like you said, when it comes to like academia, you're looking at it from a textbook approach that sometimes where the missing side of things is. And this is kind of where I've always saw kind of the flaw. And trust me, I'm always one to make sure I'm following the literature, but in terms of physique sports are even N of one type of individual, when you're coaching that person one-on-one, if you're looking at a pool of people and specifically nutrition, there's such a large deviation of different types of things that are going on that, for whatever the reason may be, majority of the time it's, a lack of funding, right? They just have to be able to take whatever the funds are there and put it in the direct focus of what their outcome and what they want, right? So if they're looking at something specifically more in terms of muscular hypertrophy, well, they don't have the funds to do anything and look at the endocrine system and look at the nervous system and look at the psyche of that person. But when we look at it from a real world perspective as a coach, well, we have to take all of these things in as a variable, right? Because that's really what relies on the adherence, the longevity, the retention of that specific client.
Yeah, I totally agree. Again, I remember when we had our class last Saturday and I was like, man, like if only we could have, dived into some of the hormonal aspects from the rapid fat loss study. But, as you said, funding is usually that variable that we can't control. And as Campbell would say, there's a lot of other people that are trying to solve cancer. And we're just trying to figure out how much body fat we can get off an already lean individual. A lot of people don't care about that. But, as we can kind of attest to, like, we're in 2021. There's a lot more fad diets. There's a lot more, I guess, general knowledge of physical activity, but there's also an all-time high with, anxiety, depression, obesity. And I think, again, going into what we're going to go into today with his hormones and their particular function, if you don't mind going ahead and
Absolutely.
Speaking about that, Gillis, we can kind of figure out what is actually going on internally.
Yeah, I think what you're really looking at, like when you're talking about like what are the functions of hormones, essentially they're molecules that just are produced in our endocrine system that send certain messages to various parts of our body, right? So they're catalysts. They're catalysts that essentially secrete certain enzymes, things like hunger, blood pressure, along with a bunch of myriad of other things is too, that I think that really just is something that's oftentimes overlooked. Because again, it kind of goes back to the extreme side of things is that us as coaches, we're essentially have to make sure that we know to not be pressured by our client, because that's what our client is looking for with us, but also knowing when to hit the brakes when things aren't really going as well as what they should be, to take a step back to look at things more internally. And a lot of times that does root to hormones. I mean, if you look at our coaching space or the coaching industry as a whole, well, it's predominantly female. It's predominantly female, right? And then when you start diving into the whole hormonal side of things, that this is something that I've always noticed, right? And maybe it's just something that I've actually noticed, right? If you look at physique sports in general, well, women have a higher probability of developing thyroid issues. The statistics, the data is there for that, all right? Well, if you're looking at some of the things, and this isn't to discredit anything in the natural bodybuilding world, it's because it's where I was brought up. But if you actually look at it, it's predominantly male. Okay, that really kind of keep that sport thriving. Whereas majority of the women, essentially, they're in the IFBB NPC side of things, right? Especially like the bikini gals. Well, keep in mind that some of the policies that really kind of take a toll in terms of the natural bodybuilding space is that you can't be on thyroid medication. Okay, so they're as a product of that, they essentially kind of can't. And because you see that a lot, they have no reason to actually be in some of those organizations if they can just compete at NPC, because those things aren't policed. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I had no idea about that. So that's interesting, and it's kind of like feeding that negative feedback loop.
Mhm.
But yeah, so I get, in the hormonal aspect, what are some of those key hormones that you pay attention to, or all of the other coaches out there that should kind of really be knowledgeable about and they should look for within all of their clients?
I think the biggest one is probably going to be thyroid hormone, just because, for us as coaches, majority of the people that are coming to us is primarily for fat loss, right?
And first, what are some ways to measure this even? It's not something we were going to talk about, but like
Mhm.
for any other coaches that might be listening to this, they might
Yeah.
not have example reading the hormonal blood work. What are some indicators that can be caught by this too?
Sure. So that's a great point, man, because majority, you're right. Like, yeah, we can explain to them to go get blood work, or maybe they can send you blood work. But if you don't know how to interpret it, know how to read it, then it's really no use. It's not a tool for you then, right? But if you're looking at from more of the practical approach, or what are some of the things that you should be looking for from their biofeedback in terms of like, okay, this person probably has this issue, it's going to be weight loss resistance, which is, again, this is where the whole reverse dieting came into thing years ago, and seeing like, well, when reverse dieting first came out, my first thought is, well, what's the difference between somebody that can respond really well to reverse dieting? What's the other person that's gaining 30 pounds on the same rate of change in macros? Okay. And so that's what made me kind of like, there's something internally going on that nobody's really paying attention to. So when you're looking at that, the primary things you're going to look for is going to be the rate in which they're losing weight, or if they're not losing weight at all, especially when you see the expenditure, it should be where it's at. When all things are actually consistent, the client is tracking appropriately. So there's not a learning curve there. So there's not a learning point there. They're already experienced with that, and you're just not seeing their respond as they should. So that's a red flag that there's probably something going on. Specifically, thyroid hormone has probably metabolically adapted, the metabolic rate.
So
So,
go ahead, Chris.
so for an individual that is reverse dieting,
Mhm.
that is just they're chronically gaining weight quickly,
Sure.
and it's not stopping. It's not, you mentioned some people go through a reverse diet, it goes smoothly. Maybe even initially they start to lose weight. But other people is just not like that. What are some steps to help those individuals?
So a couple of things, right? So if we kind of back up a little bit and we look at thyroid, right? And so when we think about what thyroid essentially does for our metabolic rate, what helps us actually utilize and oxidize lipid metabolism and carbohydrate metabolism, right? So if someone already has something suboptimal going on there, then the person that has a better thyroid function is essentially going to be able to oxidize and metabolize these things much more efficiently. Hence, you'll be able to see much more mitigation of fat regain occurring as you're bringing up food. Where if the other person has never actually seen that, and maybe they might have higher blood sugar, maybe their thyroid is actually not in a good place. And so for that reason, they may naturally have a higher fasted blood glucose. But yet, if the coach is pushing carbs and we're not checking blood glucose, then essentially, why would you push a substrate that is not even being utilized efficiently in the system? So utilizing a simple tool if they don't have blood work is utilizing maybe a glucometer to actually check blood sugar in the morning to say, okay, as a coach, if their blood glucose is pushing 100, probably not ideal for the keep ignoring that and just continue pushing carbs.
Now, in that case, would you try to have them focus more on increasing fat than initially? And then when would you know to transition to more of a carb focus increase?
So in that case, you would, but again, that doesn't always fix the case too, because you also want to make sure that what exactly is the cause for high blood sugar in the first place, right? Because again, if you don't fix what's the root cause of it, it's just going to stay there. You know what I mean? So again, you want to make sure that there isn't anything going on with cortisol, the stress hormone cortisol, because that can also inhibit the way blood glucose is actually being metabolized and things like that. So you also want to make sure that you're also supporting whatever stressors that are going to be on the system too. Again, when we're talking about this, we're talking about somebody that typically has an issue, whereas somebody that's doesn't have these issues, you don't really have to do a lot of these mitigation techniques and types of strategies.
What is, when you talk about stress and the stress hormone cortisol with
Mhm.
somebody that is just not being able to respond to whatever macronutrient targets that you're utilizing for them, what is the first thing that you kind of check within their stress response or stress environment?
Primarily just their ability to recover from the training bout, the amount of volume. If you start noticing that they're taking longer to recover, if their sleeping patterns are becoming more of a problem, maybe they can't fall asleep, or maybe they're having a hard time waking up, despite being in pretty good lean body composition. They're not extremely obese, and I've already had that as a problem. That's definitely something to consider. But that's usually the things that you would probably look for. And then also not to confuse chronic stress versus acute stress. Okay, that's also another one. And understanding that everyone's going to actually have a ceiling. How high that ceiling is going to be predicated on the person. Someone will have a much less threshold than the other. And that's why I think it's important to kind of utilize these as more of a case study approach rather than looking at like big pools of literature in that case.
Yeah, and I think building that ceiling is, like you said, working smart, not harder, maybe dialing down a little bit with your training, and then going ahead and just building quality training sessions from that. You'll be able to respond and recover, and you'll be surprised how much intensity that you can increase within those actual training sessions. And you'll be able to actually have objective increases within the weight room. I've found that not even within myself, but within a lot of clients. It's like, you don't have to go to the gym every day, right? Maybe taking, a self-care day of just going on a walk and, just breathing for a change,
Sure.
or just something like that. Because we live in this rat race environment that is like, once we get up, it's like grind time, and we can't
Absolutely, man.
stop checking our emails and our phones until it's midnight. And that just has, the heightened sympathetic state, as you've explained a little bit in itself.
Now, for the individual that takes away volume, that starts to see a positive reaction within their thyroid functioning and their hormones start to adjust a little bit better, and they start to see some benefit changes, is this a time where their volume threshold might be able to go a little bit higher? That ceiling might increase, or do you think that ceiling usually stays the same?
No, you could have some positive adaptation there too. So there is some. So it's just really essentially taking, the stressor off of the nervous system to allow those things to recover a little bit better, to be able to, again, continue pushing forward. So it doesn't necessarily they've met their genetic potential. It just means that, you have to slow down and allow some of those recovery things to be just, if not as critical as the performance side of things too, before you can actually continue pushing the gas a little bit more. And so that's probably usually some places you can go. And then also different types of strategies in terms of food intake, making sure that they're also maximizing better nutrient partitioning in the systems in that case. And again, this is an athlete versus, Gen Pop. You don't really need to do anything crazy for a Gen Pop in terms of making things overly complicated.
So I guess this is something we should have covered before, but to get to this point where you even have to reverse diet, you have to be someone who's been chronically dieting or chronically in a very low caloric, very low calorie diet for an extended period of time. What is this low calorie chronic dieting causing within the hormonal system side of things? Like, what are some natural trends that you'll generally be able to predict that'll happen?
So if you're looking at the single stressor or the double stressors, essentially from both training volume accumulation, where also being in a calorie deficit, when you kind of look, and this is something just because I've been doing this for about last 5-6 years as far as looking at labs, is that one thing you actually see is that pre and post labs, you actually see if somebody that has a really good thyroid, there's a couple of different values. So I'll talk about that a little bit in terms of looking at thyroid, so that where there's a little bit of context there. Okay. There's essentially, your TSH, which is your thyroid stimulating hormone, which is very standardized for most labs. Most people that are getting their annual checkups, that's what they get. And then also your T4, which is your inactive thyroid hormone. That's your other one component of that. But then you have your free T3, which is also the more metabolically active for what we're trying to do for someone's sustainability of weight loss. But the other one that we actually don't see a lot and oftentimes is never checked is reverse T3, which is actually the unusable form of T3. Okay. So what essentially happens is that single lab value is predicated on stress. Okay. Whether it's mechanical stress, environmental stress, emotional stress, or diet, like through nutrition. okay, that one actually increases over that prolonged period of time, over a chronic time in terms of diet or whatever the stressor may be. So when that elevates, it actually starts inhibiting the way free T3, your active thyroid hormone, is actually binding to the thyroid receptors. And that's when you start seeing some resistance starting to occur. And again, you see that a lot in either people that have chronically been in a calorie deficit or just eat very low calorie. But you also see that in the physique world with someone coming off of post-contest prep.
So does that resistance cause the T3 to become reverse T3?
So essentially what happens is T4 converts over to T3 and reverse T3, right? So if you kind of look at it from that standpoint, you're looking at the inactive becoming either active as T3, or it'll become more of the reverse, which is a conversion issue that usually occurs in the liver. So we also look at like hepatic function in terms of liver health, because that's a big one. About 80% of your actual thyroid hormone is actually metabolized and synthesized in the liver.
You know,
So,
I think.
go
Go ahead,
ahead,
Chris. No, you good? Oh, so all right. I mean, so I think with all of these hormonal aspects, what is one thing that I think we can kind of do almost immediately, other than maybe slashing some training? What is your first approach? Because I know we've talked about some sort of like detoxification methods, and in essence, right, they're allowed to almost look within their diet and just make simple, quick approaches in that aspect, and not only respond better, but just look through nutrition at a different lens.
So if the first thing I would do is essentially pull them out of the deficit, I would put them probably at maintenance and have them sit there a while. I think the biggest mistake that we see a lot of coaches do is that they immediately start reversing them, right? And they ignore the fact that they're gaining weight because like, okay, well, they're supposed to gain weight because it's a reverse. But if you just put them at maintenance and let them sit there for 3 to 4 weeks to allow the system to just recover, then you're going to probably prevent some unwanted fat gain that may or may not be easy to come off when you go to put them back in a calorie deficit. So that's the first thing that you would want to do. And the easiest way, if they don't have labs or maybe they don't want to get labs for whatever reason may be, you can check blood sugar, man, at home. I mean, a simple little glucometer, have them check that 2 to 3 times a week, first thing in the morning fasted, just so you can have somewhat of an idea of how things are actually going.
So with regards to if somebody has been chronic dieting, you're for a recovery diet of bringing them straight back up to maintenance rather than that slow reversal intake that predominantly it seems a lot of coaches do.
Absolutely, because again, what's going to happen is that you're going to put them through misery in terms of their hunger hormones just being all jacked up. And I think the best way to do it is just put them out of maintenance and allow things to just kind of get up a little bit quicker.
How are you, I guess, explaining that to the client of, okay, hey, you're at X amount of calories now. We're going to ramp you back up to maintenance. Yes, the scale is going to go up, but the response internally is going to be better for us long term.
I think it really depends on what kind of information and data they're providing and bringing to the table up front, right? So I'll kind of give you an example. I've had a client that was coming off of like a 600 calorie diet, man, super extreme, right? So this is where you have to make the call as a coach is if I put them on quote unquote calculated maintenance, and that's 1,200 calories, I'm doing 100% increase on what they're doing, right? So in that case, then I would be a little bit more conservative because chances are if they're only eating 600 calories, they're not having any hunger cues. They're not having any hunger cues at 600. They're going to not even, for one, not be able to eat that much food. So and then in that case, that would be the case where I would make the call and say, okay, well, we're going to do things a little bit more conservative so I can actually prevent some weight gain. But at least being transparent with them up front, that way they're not caught off guard that if weight occurs. Because somebody being on 600 calories, man, is, for one, I see it a lot more than you realize. 2, she had been hypothyroid for the last 5 years, which is not surprising.
So my biggest question is, how do you know if someone is trying to metabolically increase their activity regardless of the means, whether it's through increasing their nutrition, activity, whatever it is? How do you know if, I guess, the weight gain is reasonable or not? Like, how can you identify if you could be trying other things instead of focusing on increasing nutrition?
Sure. So like how much is too much in terms of a rate of weight gain? Is that what you're kind of referring
Yeah,
to?
and I
Okay.
understand like there's a rate of increase that becomes beneficial for promoting muscle mass mainly.
Sure.
So I guess keep that in mind as well.
Yeah, I think it's also predicated on what their dietary history is before we start the process. Because if they're coming from a low fat background and maybe they're eating higher fats because they tend to like that method, they're going to have some glycogen replenishment. So that's going to already be an offshift that you're probably going to see an inflated weight than what you would have normally see. That's going to eventually balance itself out. So that's usually one of the things I take into consideration. But in that case, I think it's just a matter of sometimes not being as linear. So like make sure the expectation is not there that they're expecting a shift. Even for a coach, shouldn't have to shift things from a week to week. Maybe we shift some things and maybe some things are just not moving quite as fast. So maybe we need to hold there for a little bit. We may need to hold there for 2 to 3 weeks to allow some things to catch up or some things to positively start responding. So that's kind of how I usually approach that situation.
I think that it hits a nail on the head that a lot of people don't understand. Sometimes with either recovery or reverse dieting or getting out of the fat loss phase, it's going to take time because you ran, your metabolic adaptations, you ran your hormonals to the ground. So it's not going to just happen overnight. Just like that transformation of running through the things to the floor. It's going to take a process. But what is, some of the aspects or like this, is there any sort of specific timing of either nutrition or training that you can kind of get the best bang for your buck through the hormonal response?
I think the biggest thing, man, for like when you're focusing on somebody that may have a hormonal problem, I think the biggest thing is trying to keep them out of a calorie deficit. So in that case, putting them at maintenance, being very, very, it's a delicate situation, right? Making subtle changes, making sure that depending on where their training volume is, both either if they were doing a ton of cardio, the first thing I do is I start tapering that. I don't just drop the bottom and say, hey, look, you've been doing 5 days a week cardio, we're going to go to none, so I usually start tapering that. Same thing with like step counts. A lot of people count step counts nowadays, man. So I usually try to taper those things as I'm pushing food up. And then I'm just paying attention, man, to wanting to know, like I ask on my feedback forms is like, how was your overall week? Like, they're like on a scale from 1 to 10, how would you rate your stress this past week? Because I want to know about the internal things that are going on that I know that I'm not left scratching my head with and why they're not making progress. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I totally get that. So what is, and I guess another thing too, what is the biggest cause of like, being in a caloric deficit? Like what is so catabolic and destructive of that approach for the hormonal system specifically?
Yeah. So for that one specifically, it's going to be thyroid, man. Thyroid's going to always kind of reduce over a specific amount of time. I think there was a study that we've actually had where we've seen where after about 7 to 10 days of being in a calorie deficit, where calories were reduced about, I think 20 to 35% below maintenance calories, thyroid hormones reduced to about 65%. And that was less than 2 weeks. So you're having people doing this for 3 months at a time a lot of times.
Mm-hmm. Now, what are other approaches that you would utilize to inhibit or prolong that adaptation with thyroid hormone? And then obviously you kind of already went into a lot of the other types of thyroid. What other hormones kind of, piggyback on that thyroid hormone that can only either make this process harder or make it a little bit more in favor for us if we're doing it better the next time, I guess?
Sure. So I'll answer your first question in terms of what are some things that you can kind of mitigate from, like how would you strategize to reduce thyroid in terms of down regulating. Essentially we would do some refeeds, so we're not putting them in a calorie deficit straight. Maybe we're cycling refeeds every for a female. Gender really makes a difference there too. It's important to note that for women, they have a higher probability and prevalence of adapting quicker than males. Okay. So in that case, typically we'll do a 2 to 3 day back-to-back refeed before putting them back into that. Now, when we talk about a refeed, I'm not putting them at super high macros only to off shift the cumulative numbers where nothing ever happens, right? So making sure that you're giving them somewhat of a stimulus to kind of get leptin back, because leptin is one of those responsible hormones that stimulates thyroid production, okay, TSH specifically there. So that's something that's really important, that we actually mitigate. And then if we actually are doing that for quite some time and we're still noticing a sense of rate of weight loss not occurring, and considering this person's in a calorie deficit, then at that point we kind of pull back from doing the deficit in and of itself, and we'll put them on a diet break for about, usually some people do 7 days. I'm a proponent that I've actually seen really good benefits from a 2 to 3 week diet break, just putting them back at maintenance and letting them hang out there for a little bit longer.
Now, what are some ways? We're talking a lot about these hormonal imbalances that's causing issues and becoming in a calorie deficit or losing weight or gaining weight too fast. What are some ways to really focus outside of nutrition? Because obviously that plays a very big role. What are some really good ways to recover to help these hormonal imbalances?
I think making sure that they have a really good grasp on their morning routine and their bedtime routine. What I mean by that is not waking up first thing in the morning, drinking a cup of coffee and running out the door because you have to be at work in 15 minutes. Making sure they're giving themselves enough time to actually really prioritize things and structure themselves to have better time management in that department, and doing the same thing in the evening. I think for us as coaches, that's something that we can resonate with, because primarily we work from home most of the time. We're in front of a computer all the time. It's sometimes hard to close that laptop and not think about all the emails that you might have to answer the next day. Like, think about it, man. Everybody's working from home nowadays outside of just the coaching. So like what used to be your clients working at separate from their home are now working at home on top of doing homeschooling and all of these other stressors that are actually coming out. And it's overwhelming for them. You know what I mean? So they don't get that outlet outside of their work. They're mixing their personal life within that. So I think it's important for them to, one, be able to acknowledge that and recognize that, so then they can separate that and they can actually put. So I think what was at one point coaches didn't really need to worry about, in our opinion, we take notice to that stuff.
Yeah, and go ahead, Adam.
I think that's huge, and something that as an athlete, we always it's go harder, and I take that same approach with my work. And I was like, yo, Adam, you got to chill out. So implementing what you said, a morning routine and a nighttime routine, really helped me not only just feel like, hey, I have a little bit more control in my life, but now I started responding and feel like I can, hey, I'm excited to do X, Y, Z, but have that morning routine of waking up 30 to an hour minutes earlier than where you need to be, so you can have some type of relaxation or meditation and just your me time, as we said, to kind of mitigate some of that stress. I think it's huge and something that is very underlooked nowadays.
Yeah, and it's something that I personally took for granted for a very long time until I recently got a business mentor, and I spent like a whole month looking at my schedule and like trying to figure out how to get it the most idea. And obviously sleep was a big priority of mine, trying to block off 8 to 9 hours for me, just being able to sleep, but then an hour and before, an hour and after where I'm not doing anything. And not even setting up the morning and nighttime routine, but just understanding that you should have a schedule for yourself and having times where, okay, like I have to run home and take my dog out. Like, let's not leave 15 minutes for that. Like, we need to set a little bit more than 15 minutes, because we're also going to have to eat when we go home too. And if you give yourself 10 minutes to do those two things, you're going to be every single day, you're going to be going nonstop. So besides setting a schedule, what are some other things that could help possibly focus on these hormonal recovery methods?
I mean, I think other than that, you could utilize some things like supplementation to allow your body, like things like ashwagandha has a lot of good research in terms of like the hormonal stress response, particularly like cortisol, things like that. So I think that's important too, because if you can do things like that, also kind of pulling back, and I know a lot of people aren't probably going to want to hear this, but pulling back from stimulants and caffeine, man, we live in a very caffeinated world where we're running on stimulants, and that takes a toll on adrenal health, man, and the way we act, our stress responses. And like I said, I know a lot of people don't like to hear that, man, but It is what it is. That's the honest truth.
Guys, he's saying a lot of people don't like to hear it, but like right now I'm one of those people that I don't want to hear it. I'm over here drinking caffeine like it's my job half the day. And I'm like, I know that I should get off it, but I love that you mentioned ashwagandha too, because that's actually something I take every single day, 1,000 milligrams. And I'm not huge on pushing supplements, but when it's simple things like that, or I know there's certain teas, herbal teas out there, but I haven't looked into those because I hate the taste of tea.
Sure.
I know there's tea, and there's a lot of natural supplements that'll just be beneficial in either for guys increasing testosterone or naturally decreasing cortisol. So those things are extremely important to note. You also have your schedule to recap. And then also nutrition. Those are three big things that you guys could really focus on to really help the hormonal side be beneficial for your progress in the gym itself. It's not just the gym, it's outside. But Gillis, I'm curious, what's your view on calories in, calories out? Now, a lot of people might not like to hear this one either.
Sure. So so this is the thing, right? As like we talked about this earlier in this, right? Is like, this is kind of on the very forefront in regards to like looking at the hormonal adaptations that are essentially occurring and what may be that may be the single-handed bottleneck of someone's progress, right? But I really think that when you look at calories in versus calories out, they're not 100% exclusive of one another. They need to be considered on both parties, right? You can't really 100% go and say, hey, I'm going to help someone because they have hormone issues if they don't have a constant understanding of generalized foundational nutrition in terms of eating in their calories. They're eating 10% of their total calories is coming from is protein. And that's it, right? And the remaining 90% is coming from carbs and fats, right? So having a really good understanding for their clients to understand that. So, and I think that a lot of people that are really saying, oh, hormones don't matter or something like that, well, I think they're missing the boat that most of the, like what we often talk about in terms of hormones are not exclusively saying, hey, hormones are all that matter, but I think that what's easy, I think it's an easy route to cop out, in my opinion, is that the easy thing is calories in, calories out is all that matters. Hormones are hard, man. They're like, not a lot of people understand them. Not a lot of people have background in them, but I can tell you, I've seen it in the 5 years of not only, working as being an athlete for one, okay, but two, also being in the research realm. When I was through my graduate school and going through things, my graduate school was muscular hypertrophy, right? That was my background. But then, post grad, I spent 4 years looking at labs in a clinical space because my undergrad was clinical. So I had a combination of both, and they both had some huge importance to seeing things as a coach.
Yeah, I think that's huge because it seems like a lot of us have this dichotomous thinking. It's either calories in versus calories out, or some people are like, it's all hormones and that hormones are all that matter. But it seems like, again, we need to find that midline that, again, they're all intertwined. As you said, everything is got to look at that holistic approach because it's about that person in the middle. It's not about me or it's not about favoring one side or the other. I think, the most important thing is that we just, instead of, bickering back and forth, a lot of us, we just need to have conversation like this. And I think that's one of the most important things from having you on, having Will on, is Chris and I have learned a bunch. And it's an exciting approach. And as you said, they're hard, but with anything that is new, it's going to be hard. But with experience and in time, we'll be able to digest it and help that person in the middle.
Yeah. And if any coaches are listening to this and it's just super confusing, like, I'm right there with you. Like, I'm writing notes down as Gillis is speaking, because the whole idea about how the hormonal side response and the endocrine, I feel like that should have been a course within itself in my grad program, like the endocrine system. And
we had cardiovascular, we had neuromuscular. And if you really think about it, the most important system, in my opinion, is like that nervous system and those endocrine systems, because they send the messages or transpire those messages for everything else to kind of uphold and either have a response or whatever outlook or outlet you're trying to have.
And it's very briefly talked about too, like leptin, ghrelin, I think T4, T3.
We didn't have a damn thing about thyroid hormone in our graduate class.
Yeah, right? I mean, like, these terms might have gotten like tossed into a slide here and there, and it's like, oh, TSH, what is that? That's just... And
Gillis, do you think that is just because it's complicated, or I think one of the indication is possibly lack of funding, or it seems like just people just don't want to have an open mind. I don't know the answer to that.
I think it's important to understand too that you have to look at like coaches that have built their business, very, very successful businesses from 10 years ago off of calories in, calories out. From a business perspective, why would you change your business model now? You know what I'm saying? That also is a lot of resistance there too. So I think it's also important to understand that, as being one of the bottlenecks, I think, just as in our industry, man. And I think that our industry is starting to, like, on both sides of the thing, right? You have coaches that are really wanting to be open-minded more now to both aspects, but you also have more educated clients coming into the space too that want more than a single-handed response of saying, all right, I don't need to change my macros this week.
Yeah, I agree. I think I still have sometimes some phone calls. It's like, okay, they have no idea what a macronutrient is, or I have some people. It's like, yo, we can get started right away. Like, your shit. And sometimes it's just me holding them accountable, and so they don't feel like they're spinning their wheels, but having some sense of direction. But I think, as you said, right, we should always be striving to educate ourselves and know more, to pass that on to our clients or to other coaches that want to be coaches, because that in itself is gonna stop this dichotomous thinking of, hey, it's only calories in versus calories out, or it's XYZ.
Yeah. I think it's important to understand one thing too, man, is it's better to have all your tools in a tool belt and never have to use them than to not have the tools necessary for somebody that's seeking your help.
Exactly. Gillis, what for our listeners, could you give maybe like 3 book recommendations for hormonal health? And if you could also, tell them where they could find you and your services, please.
Yeah, man. So I think some of the books that are really important specifically, I think if you're a female, because again, our space is really, really heavily in that department, looking at the book, because again, I know we talked a lot about thyroid stuff, but you could look at something, it's called the cortisol connection, which actually deals with stress responses. And that would help out a lot of people, man, I think, in regards to both genders. But then there's one called Period Repair Manual, which is another really good one that really kind of breaks down, and it's an easy level for both coaches and I think clients would be important to have. Because a lot of women in our space are dealing with some form of hormonal dysfunction in that department as well. So I think that would be highly, something highly recommended for them to have too.
And something that you touch on at ACS is, right, a lot of individuals, when they get their blood panels back, a lot of their doctors will A-OK them. But what is actually going on, would you say, Gillis?
I think so. That's a whole rabbit hole we can go down, man. But what I'll say, man, is like, you have to understand one thing is that most physicians only have about 10 minutes to be able to review someone's labs or to meet them. Okay. And because in our healthcare system, most, like, your general practitioners are so busy to seeing so many, they're so overworked and overbooked that they're about 12 to 20 years behind on the literature that's come out. So they're still doing traditional practices that are 12 to 20 years old. Okay. So, and it's easier for them to have a reference interval on a lab panel. It's not highlighted. It's not red flag. So therefore nothing's wrong. Okay. So they're not looking at it from a perspective of what's a functional range to get someone to not have the negative symptoms that they may be experiencing. They're only looking at it perspective from a diagnosis. They're never looking at it from a perspective of prevention. Okay. Are there symptoms?
So just because your hormonal may be A-OK, they could actually not be A-OK according to who you are. And I think that's something that, with research, right, we look at averages within our pool. And I think that's, like, as you're trying to say, a lot of the doctors do, and they don't even have the time sometimes to really find out who you are. So find the educated dieter. Gillis, where can they find you, my man?
Yeah, man, you can find me on social media on Instagram, man, it's just my name, Gillis, Gillis, 331. You can find me on there. And William and I have a podcast also Shameless plug there. But
what's it called? What's it called? Let them know.
So it's called Hey Coach Radio, man. It's myself, William, and I'm the co-host with that podcast, man.
The way you guys have it set up too, it's more of like a series, right?
It is. Yeah. And again, man, a lot of the stuff we talk about, I think our first 5 episodes had absolutely nothing to do nutrition related, man. It's really just kind of talking about our background, some of our upbringings, more on a personal level, I think, which is important for people to get to know us a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. So if you guys liked what you guys heard from him today, go ahead, check him out at his website. Go ahead, check out that podcast. You'll get to know him and William at the Educated Diet a little bit more, and maybe they'll be able to give you a little bit more insight, whether you're a coach or you're a client looking for a new coach. But other than that, that was all the smoke on hormones, guys. Thank you and have a great day.